Dr. Logan. Next report, please. Should be in here.
This requires to be convened.
Please be seated. Mr. Parrish, you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Henry. We'll call Dr. William Logan, and she just went to get him. He should be here in a sec. Can you come forward, please?
Come on up here, Dr. Logan.
Where's my sheet, Mert?
Right up here.
I had it here a minute ago. My qualification sheet.
Is there a place you want me to stop?
You can set your stuff, stand there by the chair. You can set your stuff kind of back and behind there.
Thank you.
Before you sit down, please raise your right hand for me. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that any testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please take your seat. Please state and spell your name for the record.
Okay. The first name is William, spelled W-I-L-L-I-A-M. Middle name is Searle, spelled S-E-A-R-L-E. And the last name is Logan, spelled L-O-G-A-N.
Your witness, Mr. Parrish.
Thank you, Your Honor. What is your occupation?
I am a psychiatrist that specializes in forensic psychiatry. A psychiatrist is a branch of medicine. I'm a medical doctor as well.
And what would you tell the jury where your employment address or your business address is, please?
My office is based in Kansas City, Missouri. The office address is 428 West 42nd Street, Kansas City, Missouri 64111.
And Doctor, we have a copy of your curriculum vitae, but I'm going to highlight a few points on it before we introduce it. And I'm going to have you start, Doctor, after high school. Where are you from originally, first of all?
I was born in Houston, Texas.
Okay. Would you tell us after high school where you received your degrees from, please?
Yes, by the time I graduated from high school, I was living in far west Texas, where my father worked at a missile range for the federal government, testing government contract weapons. I went to college in southern New Mexico at New Mexico State University and got a bachelor's degree in biology with a specialization in microbiology and also a second Bachelor of Arts in psychology. You want me to go on?
Yes, sir. And where did you get your medical degree from?
I was a Texas resident, so I went to the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, and that's located in Dallas, Texas. And I completed 4 years of medical school, stayed there to do my psychiatric training, some of which was in neurology and internal medicine. The psychiatric training was between two different hospitals. One was Timberlawn Psychiatric Hospital, which was a long-term facility. And then the second hospital was Baylor Medical Center there in Dallas. They also have a Baylor in Houston. This is the one in Dallas.
And tell us briefly, and we'll get back a little bit into your qualifications, but tell us the name of your business now and the type of practice you have right now, so the jury can understand that.
Sure. The practice that I have right now is called Logan and Peterson. It's made of two individuals, myself and Dr. Peterson. I'm the Logan and Logan Peterson, and there's a Dr. Peterson who lives actually in the St. Louis area, but he comes over to Kansas City some, and sometimes I go over there. And we've been in practice since 1993.
Doctor, can I have you slow down just a little bit?
Okay.
And tell us, doctor, the nature of your practice, so the jury have an understanding of your day-to-day business. They may be interested in knowing what you do every day, patients you see, and this type of thing.
Most days, I see a series of patients with various diagnoses. Common ones are post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorders or depression, sometimes adolescents and young adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I do a fair number of people who have been in traumatic work injuries. There was a restaurant that exploded and one person was killed in Kansas City a year or so ago. I saw a number of people that were involved in that restaurant explosion. I wind up seeing a number of people who have been involved in various types of work-related traumas or automobile accidents and things of that nature. I also do court cases of various kinds from time to time, all the way from child custody disputes all the way up to capital homicide cases.
And let's talk a little bit about your training, doctor. You told us that you were a forensic psychiatrist. Could you tell the jury, so we will understand the difference between a forensic psychiatrist and one who is just a regular psychiatrist, so to speak?
A forensic psychiatrist is one that examines situations to render some opinion that might have legal relevance, and it can vary from topics as diverse as how extensively somebody was injured in an accident in terms of, say, somebody who suffered a brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder, or who might be the better custodial parent in a child custody situation, to whether somebody was competent to make a will, or in a criminal matter whether they were competent to stand trial, or what their mental state might have been.
Let me ask you, doctor, in distinguishing a forensic from a regular psychiatrist, were there additional areas of study that you had to do, or how you get qualified in forensic psychiatry?
Okay. I wound up in that area because I had received a scholarship through medical school. And the requirement of the scholarship was that I go to work in an underserved area. And the underserved area the Public Health Service sent me to was a place called the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. And they did evaluations for the federal district courts nationwide, primarily on criminal cases. And a great deal of the people that I saw were people that had threatened the life of then President Reagan, because I went there immediately after Hinckley shot Reagan. And gradually I got interested in that, so after the 3 years were up, I did a special year of training called a fellowship, and that was done at the Menninger Clinic, which was a private psychiatric facility in Topeka, Kansas.
All right, and tell us just briefly the Menninger Clinic, doctor. Many of us have heard about that, but could you describe to the jury its role in the mental health industry in the world and in the United States? And briefly describe that for us, please.
Okay, it was started in Topeka, Kansas by a family of psychiatrists. The original doctor was a OBGYN and pediatrician, but he had two sons that were interested in nervous and mental disorders. One of them wrote quite widely about mental health issues. His name was Carl Menninger. There was also one named Will Menninger who wound up becoming the chief psychiatrist for the Army during World War II. After World War II, they realized that there are quite a few soldiers with what we now term post-traumatic stress disorder. The government realized that a lot more psychiatrists needed to be trained. They built a 500-bed psychiatric VA hospital in Topeka and also the state hospital there. was under the control of the Miniger Clinic, and for a number of years they trained the highest number of psychiatrists nationwide, 100 a year. The next largest program was Bellevue in New York that only trained 19 a year. So they developed a very wide national, and then as people came from abroad to study, international reputation in psychiatry.
And was the Miniger Institute considered one of the top psychiatric facilities in the world?
Yes, you know, for many, many years was rated number one, and the survey of hospitals that U.S. News will report did.
And what position, tell the jury, that you held in that particular institution?
Well, after I finished my training there, I was asked to stay on and take over the department there that was the Law and Psychiatry Department, and then I was the director of that department for another 8 years. And then gradually Miniger started to downsize and culminated in a move to Houston to become part of the Baylor Department of Psychiatry there. Our department decided to remain in Kansas City and went private.
And doctor, are you board certified in forensic psychiatry?
Yes, I'm board certified in regular psychiatry and by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, and also in forensic psychiatry.
And doctor, at some point have you trained psychiatry, or at least tested people who wanted to reach into your field of forensic psychiatrists? Did you assist in training them or serve on the testing of those people who would qualify for that particular area?
Yes, I've been the director of a forensic fellowship, which is a training program for forensic psychiatrists, and I've also sat on the board as an examiner for people that were taking the exam.
And you have, as you've mentioned in passing, doctor, testified in court, is that correct?
Yes.
You talked about your training when you were evaluating people who had threatened the life of the President of the United States, President Reagan, at one point. In any of those cases, did you have to testify in court, or what was the purpose of your testing or evaluation? What were you attempting to do?
Basically, in those cases, like in all criminal cases, there were questions that started off with whether they were able to understand what went on in a courtroom, whether they could work with their attorney, did they know what they were being charged with. In a few cases, there was an issue about what their state of mind would have been when they, committed the illegal act, whether they were drunk or whether they were mentally ill or delusional. On other cases, it may have been a request from a judge who wanted to know what would be effective sentence for this individual. Whether somebody who could live in the community again, or did they need to be in a mental hospital? What kind of parameters need to be set on their behavior.
So you would then interview the person and then make a recommendation with regard to the court regarding your medical opinion, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Doctor, what we'd like to do now, if you could, tell us the difference between what's called a forensic psychiatrist in the area that you work in and have worked in for a number of years, and a forensic psychologist. Could you tell the jury the difference between those two?
Yes. The training between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is different in terms of the way they're trained in the background. Psychiatrists, which is what I am, basically go through medical school, and all doctors in medical school take the same line of study. We all study basic sciences like cell physiology and biochemistry and microbiology and pathology and pharmacology. And then the last 2 years you go through a series of rotations in things such as internal medicine, OBGYN, pediatrics, surgery. There's some electives and things like electrocardiograms or pulmonology, neurology, dermatology that we all go through. And then you graduate with your medical doctorate and you're licensed to practice by the state. But in almost all the fields, there's just a beginning of another phase where doctors subspecialize, and some go into internal medicine, some go into pediatrics, family practice. In my case, I went into psychiatry, and part of that involved, because there's some overlap, some months spent in internal medicine and some months spent in neurology, because there's overlap in those fields. People can present with a medical illness and it actually is a psychiatric illness, or vice versa. In fact, the boards in psychiatry still are the only ones that combine two different specialties in one board, and that being psychiatry and neurology, because there's been traditionally so much overlap between those two fields.
And in psychology...
The psychologist, yeah, getting to part B may be too lengthy an
Right,
answer.
no, that's all. Just tell us briefly in the psychology the difference.
The difference in psychology is they don't go to medical school at all. They go to graduate school, and their approach to diagnosing mental illness is to give the person a test or a series of questions that are then statistically compared to other people with various diagnoses who've answered this test. And they can tell whether the individual might be trying to exaggerate their answers or minimizing problems that might be wrong with them by the way they answer these questions. They also can find out where the person might fit diagnostically. Now, both fields have training in doing various types of talk therapy with patients. So there's some overlap between psychiatrists and psychologists, and that both do that. And psychiatrists are the ones that typically also prescribe the medication because they've had training in pharmacology. In some states, psychologists also can take some additional training in pharmacology and may prescribe as well.
And doctor, where are you licensed to practice? Would you tell us, please?
Sure, I'm licensed in the states of Texas, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska.
And doctor, with regard to your testimony, would you tell us where you testified as an expert witness, please? I mean, don't list them off, but give us just an idea.
Okay, well, most of my career has been spent here in the Midwest, and so it's not unusual for me to testify in states in the center of the country, particularly Kansas and Missouri, occasionally Iowa and Nebraska, sometimes Arkansas and Oklahoma, rarely outside that area. And over the course of my career, I've testified all the way from places as far away east as Long Island and as far west as California, but those are much less frequent.
And you've testified as an expert in those areas, is that correct?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what is marked. I previously shown to the state of Iowa what is marked as Defendant's Exhibit X. And would you take a look at this document and tell us whether or not that is an accurate update with regard to what is your curriculum vitae?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. We move to admit Defendant's Exhibit X.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Defendant's Exhibit X is admitted.
Doctor, prior to the time you were asked to assist with the evaluation and preparing a report on Alex Kozak, did you know him at all?
No.
And I didn't ask you this, but when you were asked to evaluate for the purposes of giving an opinion with regard to someone's mental state or medical condition, would you give the jury some idea, if you don't know that person, what type of information you need to be able to use your skills as a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate them?
You basically start by doing a psychiatric evaluation of the individual, and then so doing, you get a overview of his life history and how he's adjusted at various ages, starting from when he was growing up as a kid. You might want to know about issues of significant family members who have died, parents that have been divorced, how frequently the family moved, did he have mental health treatment, was he abused in some ways, did he witness violence. All of these kinds of issues can have an impact on somebody's adult mental health development. You then go on to go through his life and history and find out what kind of stressors have been there and how has he adjusted to various things. You may explore various diagnostic possibilities in terms of symptoms that he may have had or not had. Often people are not completely reliable historians about themselves, so you may want to interview people that have known him. Sometimes there are employment records, people who have interacted with him at work, friends, family members, people that have known him over a long time might be able to tell you whether there's been a recent change in his demeanor or his behavior. You also, of course, if there's been a criminal offense, you have a fairly extensive body of investigative materials. The police have actually usually done an interrogation of him. It's usually recorded. There's also been various laboratory testing. If a crime has been committed, as in this case, there are witness statements. Sometimes you even look at things like their Facebook page, or in this case, I believe texting was a significant component of the situation, and so you looked at, we were able to get them at text messages that have been exchanged. So basically, you get as many sources of information as you can. Sometimes you get a lot, sometimes you don't get so much, but you don't close anything off. Everything is potentially a good source of information.
Does that include a doctor visiting with family members, those people who may know an individual best?
Yes, particularly if you want to know if there's been a change. What's been their experience of him? What was he like, as a child? What kind of stressors did he have in adolescence? Have they noticed things along the way that may have been a problem for him?
Okay. And did you gather information such as what you would need as a forensic psychiatrist, as you have outlined those factors? Did you gather that information with regard to Alexander Kozak?
I did.
And Doctor, and we'll get into it later, but based upon your background, your experience, your work history, your education, based upon your writings, your classes you've attended, and the experience you've gained that you've outlined to this jury briefly from your curriculum vitae, were you able to form an opinion with regard to Mr. Kozak to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as whether or not he had a medical condition that you could diagnose?
Yes.
And did you formulate an opinion with regard to that?
To his diagnosis? Yes.
And first of all, would you tell the jury what that diagnosis was?
I believe he has a condition called an intermittent explosive disorder. Underneath that, I also believe he has something we call a borderline personality disorder.
And would you tell us with regard to Mr. Kozak, what did you base that opinion on, please? Outline those factors for the jury.
I based my opinion primarily on, to some degree, on information from him, but also on information from his mother and sister and wife, and to some degree from the emails and also other people that he knew, including another individual named Jessica German, and some of their email conversation.
Okay. Are you able to explain to this jury what an intermittent explosive disorder is, Doctor?
Yes.
Would you explain to the jury what that type of disorder is and what a person with that particular mental condition, how they react?
Okay. The basic characteristic of that name, what it actually means is that someone is prone to explosive outbursts that are vastly out of proportion to what may have triggered that. In other words, they may take some small slight or some small event in their life to which most of us would see as a mild irritant, and react with an episode of rage. So that basically the key factor is a reaction that is greatly out of proportion to anything that might have precipitated that.
Are there certain symptoms, doctor, or signs that you are able to look at as a forensic psychiatrist that points to that particular diagnosis?
Yes. Typically, you have to get the history from people of various incidences where this has occurred, going back over a few years. And I was able to get a history of that from his mother and sister and wife. It also is extremely common in some people who have underlying personality disorders, particularly one called borderline personality, in which there's a great deal of instability in a person's interpersonal relationships and their self-image and in their ability to control their emotional expression. And he had a number of symptoms that fit into that particular character of personality disorder, which often leads to mood shifts and depression, briefer episodes of paranoia, and also explosive anger outbursts.
Okay. Would you describe for this jury those incidents that you observed in Alexander Kozak's life that assisted you in reaching this diagnosis?
Sure. Okay. Going back historically, most of these are not from Mr. Kozak himself because he's not particularly insightful, but these are observations from family members. There was an incident back in high school where I guess he had brought a knife to school. He had a habit of collecting knives. One of the characteristics of this personality disorder is that people are impulsive, and sometimes he would make impulsive trips to places like Corpus Christi to buy knives. But anyway, he had bought this knife to school, and they got sanctioned for it and became absolutely livid and irate that the principal wouldn't let him explain and started actually growling. Nothing violent happened out of that, but his mother recalled that his reaction was very extreme compared to what the situation was. There was also an incident close to, I guess preceding his senior year, where he had a friend who had a drug abuse problem, and the friend's father had asked Alex to intervene, and Alex had gone out to confront this guy with basically a baseball bat. Mother was concerned. He looked like he was on a mission. He just seemed like he was enraged. Fortunately, there was no confrontation because this fellow had already left the area where he expected to find him. There was also another occasion in 2011 where he was with his sister at a mall. Somebody made a catcall or a lewd comment. He waited till his sisters were out of the area and then went back and confronted this guy and threatened to kill him. Once again, quite a display of temper. The day after he graduated from high school, he abruptly left for Colorado. Didn't tell his parents or his mom where he was going or anything about it. And mom filed a missing persons report. He eventually called, I guess, from Colorado, and he ran out of money. One of the things that I noticed significantly, this was just after he had broken up with a girl. And one of the things that ties into his personality difficulties is there are some individuals with this borderline personality who will over-idealize a romantic attachment, and then when that attachment disappoints them in some way, that person will completely shift 180 degrees, and this person goes from being wonderful to somebody who's evil, terrible person, and sometimes the changes literally over a course of minutes or hours in how they view somebody. So some of this, and they're also very prone to show impulsive relationships around, or actions around relationship difficulties. Apparently, at one point, a preacher had come to bless their house, and he was angry that he was being interrupted with a phone call, and he refused to get off the phone. There are also times when his sister saw him basically slam the door and throw a keyboard because he was having trouble accessing a YouTube video. There was another time when he got extremely angry and volatile at his brother-in-law over an issue as simple as not being able to remove some bolts for a license plate on the car. He also could be quite volatile with his wife. There was a time when she was decorating for a Halloween dance, and he became enraged that she seemed to be having too good a time and literally drug her away from the dance. There was another occasion, I guess, when she had first started at the University of Iowa when he was down in Texas, where she had her roommate's boyfriend help her set up a futon and told him about it over the phone. He became absolutely enraged. His wife said that these rage attacks didn't last very long, usually 30 minutes, maybe 45, but at times, depending on his mood, he could have as many as 5 a day. And the family had noticed a change in his mood, that he was becoming more depressed in the spring. There were big alterations in his ability to sleep. He would not sleep much in March and April, and then would sleep long hours in May. There was also some data from work that probably has been introduced. Certainly one of his supervisors, Wendy Robbins, talked about him getting angry about an interaction actually with the victim in this case, who had complained about him harassing her, and he did not react well to that. If one examined the text messages, it looks like within very short periods of time, she would be texting him, sometimes romantically, and then complaining that he was harassing her. At another time, he got extremely irate, and this was just about 8 days before all this happened, about a fire report, and basically almost threatened to walk off the job, and became so irate he really wouldn't even talk about it. And then there was another instance where he had gotten extremely angry about the fact that he had overreacted. Thank you. And talked about, well, there had been some adolescence, and apparently he'd made a bad judgmental error to pepper spray some of these kids, and had gotten called down about that at work. And then his supervisor had told him that if there was, if Andrea Farrington had made further complaints about him, he might be terminated. So there was a series of him showing increased emotional instability, more frequent displays of temper, overreacting to events that kind of led up to this particular incident.
I want to talk about the last incident you mentioned, Doctor, and ask you a question. The way you look at, from your opinion, the way you look at Alex Kozak. With the last incident with his boss, and I call him Si because I don't want to mess up his last name, comes in and talks to him about Ms. Farrington, and obviously you've read those text messages now, coupled with the incident of him improperly using his pepper spray with these young kids. If he was confronted with that situation by his boss, based upon your opinion, are you able to formulate an opinion as to what his reaction would be like under those circumstances with that diagnosis?
He never was very skilled in relationships, even growing up. I mean, he was always an outsider, kind of a loner, frequent school shifts. He really didn't know how to read people or how to react properly to them. And my thought is that he would likely become very angry and very defensive and not be someone who took supervision well.
If he did not have those skills, Doctor, in your opinion and based upon your review of him, how then, based upon your look at the text messages we've gotten, is he able to communicate so effectively or to some extent communicate with text messages? How do you assess that?
Well, I don't know that that I saw his communication with text messaging as being particularly effective. At some point, I remember Andrea Farrington was fairly candid with him about the fact that it made her uncomfortable continuing the relationship because he was married. And there was a discussion of that, and that apparently he had talked about leaving his wife for her, and she said, basically, I don't want you to do it for me. If you want to do it for you, that's fine, but if you leave your wife for me and then the relationship doesn't work out, you'll blame me. And then at other times, she would say that he was bothering her, he was creeping her out, and he was not particularly good at following up on what she meant by that, or reading the fact that she was having some reservations and respecting her boundaries. I think on one occasion he had bought her some flowers, and this was a relationship that was, for the most part, only through texting. They really had never had, I think, even gone as far as making out. And this had assumed a much larger than life role. For somebody you've never met, I mean, they were really engaging in some intimate messages going back and forth that was just completely out of proportion to the actual nature of the relationship, which was actually very casual.
And for a person who's been diagnosed with the borderline personality and intermittent explosive disorder, Doctor, and in reviewing the text messages, do you have an opinion as to whether or not those text messages could have had any impact on him with that diagnosis?
Well, particularly in a borderline personality, they're very susceptible to imagined slights in relationships. They don't handle relationship breakups very well. They tend to become very paranoid about somebody, to suspect their motives, intense anger, paranoia, even sometimes kind of dissociative episodes where they kind of act like they're on automatic pilot are even possible in those situations. They're certainly not someone who's stable enough to take normal give and take in a relationship, and so there's always a risk that at some point they'll explode.
And based upon your professional opinion, Dr. Logan, and with a review of all of the information that you've had in front of you and that you have in fact discussed in some detail with the jury, have you reached that opinion to a reasonable degree of, or do you have opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty and psychiatric certainty as to whether or not on the 12th of June 2015 did Alexander Kozak suffer from that particular mental disorder?
Yes, that is my opinion.
And is it your opinion that he was suffering from it on that date?
Yes.
2015. Doctor, have you had an opportunity to look at some other reports, one being from a Dr. Cochler?
Yes.
And you've described in your opening introduction, direct examination, there's a difference between a psychologist, a forensic psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a forensic psychiatrist. As a forensic psychiatrist, are you able to read, study, and formulate opinions based upon reports from psychologists?
Yes, do that all the time. I mean, actually, the two professionals work very closely together in most cases.
And you actually have a psychologist in your office with you, is that correct?
Not currently, but we have had in the past. He retired.
And that's Dr. Peterson.
No, Peterson is not a psychologist. He's a psychiatrist. I actually trained him as a forensic fellow. He's a medical doctor.
So how do you become familiar with reading the test then? And you can just tell us briefly how you would train.
Okay, well, basically, most of the tests actually are computer scored. All you need to do is enter the answers into the computer, and they print out the various scales in a report based on it. But if you have a psychologist there, and we often work with one, they will give you their interpretation of it too. Now, where we collaborate is both psychologists and psychiatrists take a person's history and examine their symptoms and learn things about them, and we share that information and usually collaborate on a diagnosis.
Okay. And in this case, did you review Dr. Cochler's report?
Yes, I did.
And did you review the testing?
Yes.
All right. Are you familiar with either of the tests that were administered by him to Alexander Kozak?
Well, there were a number of them. It weren't just a couple, but.
All right. Tell us about those tests.
Well, you know, basically, one of the tests is really designed to determine whether a person's answering in a valid manner.
When you say one of them, would you mind naming the test if you know?
Oh, I'd have to dig his report out.
Oh,
And
that's
I think
right.
it's a validity indicator profile is one of them.
Could you say that again?
VIP, validity indicator profile. Okay. And this test showed that he may not have answered things in a completely forthright manner. He may have embellished his symptoms some. It doesn't tell you why he may have done that. But it means that whatever results you get from whatever he's provided you via that method, you know, you need to be very judicious in how you interpret it or whether you use it at all. Now, an important fact to note is that Dr. Cochler examined Mr. Kozak 6 months later than I did. I did not use psychological testing. He tried to incorporate it, but ultimately we came to pretty much the same conclusion about at least a portion of his diagnosis.
And what conclusion did Dr. Cochler reach that you indicated was basically the same that you reached? Obviously, he's a forensic psychologist, you're a forensic psychiatrist. What conclusion could you share with the jury that you reached that were similar?
Basically, we both concluded that he had a pretty severe underlying personality disorder. I think, you know, whenever you do a diagnosis, it's kind of a classification system, very much like, you know, all scientists try and classify things, and sometimes you might quibble about whether it goes in box A or box B. In his case, he kind of gave him a mixed personality disorder, didn't really specify a mixture of what exactly. I thought he fit better into the borderline personality, but both of us concluded that he had a pretty severe personality disorder.
And did you both agree about the time that it started? I know the jury's heard some questions now dating back to a certain age. Do you both agree as to when it started? And Dr. Cochler, I think, in his report indicated it was about 15 or 16. Do you know whether or not you reached that conclusion following that opinion?
Yeah, mental illnesses are not like broken bones. There's no definite date of a fracture. I mean, mental illnesses come on gradually. People start seeing signs of them. I think sometimes younger kids can show a lot of behavioral problems and difficulties and emotional problems. But in many of these cases, it starts to become really evident by their mid-teens. And that seems to be the case here, although I couldn't give you, for example, a date that it started on January 1st,
Okay.
2008, or anything like that.
And Doctor, to follow up with that, and we've talked a little bit about this in general, with our et cetera, but what I'm interested in is whether or not this idea of the development of the frontal lobe of youth impacts someone who's developing this borderline personality disorder and intermittent explosive disorder. Does that factor into your consideration that Mr. Kozak was 20 years old at the time of being more noticeably having these diagnoses?
Not quite in the way that you describe it. Basically, there was a comment in my report that as an additional factor, and of course, this, that affects many young men that age. There's an area of their brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that's much slower to develop in men than in women. And it makes them much more and prone to poor judgment, impulsive behavior. The car insurance company knows this very well. If you've had a son or yourself been there, you know that your insurance rates are pretty high until you hit age 25, and then they lower your rates. And then really that corresponds pretty well to the scientific data about how quickly that area of the brain develops. And so you see young men of that age engaging in impulsive behavior, in general, more risk-taking behavior. If somebody already has other diagnoses, then that general factor that applies to everybody is going to be more severe in their particular case.
And would that be the true of Alexander Kozak?
Yes, I think that's generally true of Alexander Kozak. He, as I mentioned, had a lot of personality difficulty that we've talked about that often is a subject of treatment, and other factors played a role in that as well, but certainly that would impair him additionally.
Doctor, the last couple of questions I have for you deal with, once this intermittent explosive disorder takes place along with this personality disorder that he had, does it increase as he gets older from his teenage years with the terms of frequency? That's the first question I have for you. Then I'll have a follow-up questions on that.
There's individual variation in course, but for many individuals, the emotional upheavals and the mood shifts and the depression and impulsivity and anger outbursts and paranoia don't really start to improve until the individual gets into their 40s, around 50. Although there are medications that you can give someone to address those issues that will make a difference.
Okay. The last question I have for you is this diagnosed disorder that you found with regard to him, how long, in your opinion, does it take, and then narrowing it down to Alexander Kozak from all of your review of the information in this case, once this explosion takes place regarding this disorder, how long does it take him to calm down? Are you able to formulate any opinion on that?
Well, once again, you know, you're talking about a wide range of reactions depending on the individual, but once they get themselves into a rage state, often that can last for an hour or more. It isn't something where they go into a rage that lasts for days or weeks or anything like that. It's usually a very discrete period where they're just absolutely unable to think, unable to control their emotions.
And after that explosion, based upon your diagnosis, can you describe what their reaction would be like? Would it be like a normal individual walking around, breathing and doing work or whatever?
Well, it all depends on what they do during one of these episodes. That makes a huge difference. But often, sometimes if they do something remarkably violent, they will kind of snap back all of a sudden the violent episode itself will kind of snap them back to reality. Like they say, oh my God, what have I done? You know, or what's just happened? And it's even possible for them to be traumatized by acts they themselves have committed in the form of recurrent nightmares and intrusive thoughts and things of that nature. I think in one interview he mentioned that he was terrified and that he did snap back as soon as this happened.
I have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
Yes, thank you. I want to discuss briefly what the basis was for your opinion in terms of his background and what you obtained from his family. You indicated that his mother reported a time when he was maybe in 10th or 11th grade, I believe, where he got angry about discipline at school for bringing a knife. Is that right?
Yes, that came from his mom.
And it was your understanding that he was very angry about this, what kind of discipline there was given?
Not so much that, but that the principal didn't allow him to explain.
Okay. And did his mother also tell you she thought they were a little out of line in terms of how much discipline they gave him and what they did?
She didn't tell me that, but I'm not surprised. Mothers are often defensive about their young.
Okay. And at that time, he never became violent, is that right?
As far as I understand it, that if there was no physical acting out, he just became extremely angry.
Very angry, okay. And the same thing with the brother-in-law and the license plate. He never became violent with his brother-in-law or anything else, is that right?
No assaulting people involved in that.
Or damaging property?
Not that I understand.
And the same thing with the incident with the knife. There was no damaging property or injuring anybody or assaulting anybody or any kind of behavior like that.
You're talking about the high school thing?
Yes.
You went back to that? No. Correct.
And he would have been at the high school thing around 16 years of age, something like that, 16, 17.
I tried to date it. I think he was in his sophomore year. I think it was up in his first year going up to Osage High. And he would have been around 15.
15, okay. And the incident with the brother-in-law, was that when he was about 20, 21, something like that?
Well, he's what, 20 now?
No, he's 23 now.
23. She said it happened in 2014, as I recall.
Okay, so he would have been
Pretty close.
21.
Yeah, 21.
And the other incident you mentioned had to do with something at work where he got angry about being confronted by his boss about his use of, or his threatening use of OC spray with juveniles.
Yes.
Is that right?
Mhm.
And he never became violent on that occasion either.
No, although later I think he had some homicidal thoughts about that boss.
And that was after
Right.
he shot Andrea Farrington, though,
Right.
right? It wasn't before, it wasn't at the time he was being disciplined, anything like that, is that right?
No, I think he had gotten, made some disparaging remarks about him and thought about quitting, but I don't think he did anything. He didn't, there was no physical.
Okay. And of all the things that you learned from the family, from your interview with him, you don't know of any time prior to June 12th that he was actually violent, is that right?
There's more threats, I think, and more kind of periods where he got very livid, but I don't recall anything else where he actually did anything near this magnitude.
Okay. And the one threat you referred to was when somebody made a very inappropriate comment to his sister. You
Well,
said-
I don't know how inappropriate it was, actually, but he took offense at it and kind of overreacted to it.
Okay. If his family thought it was also inappropriate, you wouldn't dispute what they said, is that right?
I wasn't there.
Okay.
No, they were there.
And the description of him as an outsider or a loner, things like that, did that come from him?
No, not so much. It really came more from his mother.
And did she tell you he was involved in fine arts and the theater and things in high school?
Not too much,
Okay.
no.
And if she testified here in the last couple of days about him, or his sister, about him having a small but close group of friends, did you know about that?
I did know he had a couple of buddies.
And so he was able to form some kind of relationship with friends, things like that.
Yes, it was usually around video games, paintball, things of that nature.
Things that teenage boys do, is that right?
Well, some teenage boys do.
Okay. And you met with his wife, Kelly Kozak, is that right?
More through telephone interaction with her.
And she never reported any violence either, is that correct?
No, she didn't report that he abused her, no.
Okay. Or anybody else?
No, he became threatening at times, and they talked about a lot of verbal arguments, but as far as I know, there was no physical.
When people are in a relationship and having an affair and they're not sure if they're going to stay in that marriage, do they sometimes get angry?
Well, people get angry in marriages they stay in.
Okay. And,
People get angry in general.
right. Do you think it might be especially stressful if you're carrying on relationships with other women while you're married, and that might affect your mood?
Particularly if you become infatuated with one.
Okay. Or maybe more than one.
Right, or maybe more than one.
Now, I want to go through a little bit. You didn't try to do any psychological testing, is that right?
No, because basically, oftentimes it's not that particularly relevant for when you're having to go back and do something retrospective. I was seeing him quite a bit after when this occurred.
Okay, so you saw him in October of 2015, excuse me?
Yes.
Okay. And you haven't taken any classes yourself in interpreting the psychological test, is that right?
No, actually, that would be wrong. I got one of my undergraduate degrees in psychology, and I had a class in psychological testing, and I also got trained about doing that in my psychiatric residency as well.
Okay.
And then I've interacted with psychologists who have done it throughout my career.
Have you had semester-long classes in terms of, in your medical training to deal specifically with the MMPI-2?
Not specifically with the MMPI-2 all by itself, but semester-long courses, yes.
And that was when you were in an undergrad, is that right?
No, that's when I was in my psychiatric training.
In your psychiatric training. And when was that?
Oh, gosh, I'm an old fella now. It was in the late 80s. Late 70s, early 80s.
You don't try to administer or interpret the MMPI to yourself, do you?
Actually, we do give the MMPI in our office and use the interpretive reports.
Okay. Do you do that, or do you have a psychologist who does that?
Actually, we do it in our office. We're licensed to run the psychological profile and can easily do that. Pearson, the company that sells these, gives us the material to do it. I don't use it perhaps in the way that a psychologist would, but one of the things that I found is that sometimes someone will admit something in a paper and pencil test. They may not tell you face to face. So I look for, they have an item in the exam called critical items, and often maybe if there's something like suicidal thinking that they'll admit to on this test or this questionnaire, but they wouldn't tell me personally, and then I get the results back of the questionnaire, and then I say, well, listen, you mark this here, you know, that will be an introduction for me to talk about it with them.
You didn't do any psychological testing, though, on Mr. Kozak yourself, is that right?
I did not.
And you didn't ask anybody else to do any psychological testing on him, is that correct?
That is also correct.
Okay. And when you evaluated him and met with him back in October, you obtained the reports, etc., you were doing a professional job, I'm assuming, when you did that, is that right?
Sure, you don't always incorporate psychological testing in every evaluation.
Okay. And you did everything you thought you needed to do at that time regarding being able to form an opinion, is that right?
Actually, no. If you have noticed, I wrote a report for...
Yeah, let me ask you about that, excuse me.
Okay.
I think you said at the end you really you would like to have an examination of the couple's text messages might help form a clearer picture of the course of the relationship which led to the homicide?
Yes.
Okay. And so you would have liked to have had more text messages, is that right?
Yes, I also asked them for medical records, too, that I've never received.
Okay.
So, I mean, clearly, you know, at that point, things were in the preliminary phase. I had some documents, but wanted some others. And I can say that the stack of material I had back in the fall when I wrote that report was about that thick. And within the last 4 weeks, it's about this thick, over and above what I had before.
Okay.
Which is also the case in this thing. When they come up to trial, you get a big inflow of material.
Okay, let's refer to that, and I'm referring to a report that I believe you authored, and looks like it was faxed on January 28th of 2016, labeled preliminary psychiatric evaluation.
Yes.
And you include in there what kind of materials you had for that evaluation to be able to do this and to prepare for this preliminary report. Is that right?
That is right.
And that included an autobiography of Mr. Kozak prepared by his mother, Cindy McComas. Is that right?
Yes.
Copy of the trial information,
Yes.
copy of the minutes of testimony, and just...
Yeah, I mean, do you want to read the I'll say yes at the end of it, or you can do it
Okay,
individually.
I'll just read the whole list then.
Sure.
The transcript of Mr. Kozak's interview by law enforcement, and I'm assuming that was the interview done by Rick Ron that was recorded in audio and video. Maybe you just saw the transcript of that?
I just saw the transcript.
Okay, that's fine. And then the curriculum vitae of Andrew High, Communication Studies at University of Iowa, an interview of Cassie Farrington, the sister of the victim, and memo from Cassie Lee. I believe that might be Cassie Farrington to Jagat Sandhu, sent on Monday, June 15th, as well as the interview on June 15th with Cassie Farrington. That's the material you had at that time?
At that time, yes.
Okay. And since then, you've gotten a copy of Dr. Kokler's report, is that right?
Among a lot of other things, I got a copy of his report, his CV, some of the psychological test raw data.
Okay. And also a report from Dr. Anderson?
Yes.
But at
He's
the
a
time,
psychiatrist like I am.
at the time you did this report, you felt you had enough information to make a preliminary diagnosis, is that right?
Well, emphasis on the word preliminary. Yeah, I would have put final if I thought I had enough.
And when you did this report, you knew that this was what the defense was going to, Mr. Parrish was going to use to make a determination about whether he needed to file an affirmative defense in this case. Is that right?
I didn't think this was going to be used based on what I had at that moment. I thought there would be further investigation. I think he was in the process of trying to get emails, at least that's what he communicated to me.
Okay.
And the other part was suggesting to get some records about testicular cancer and things of that nature that I had heard about. So I assumed that more records would be coming.
Okay. But you tried to do your best professional work at that time, is that correct?
Yeah, based on what I had,
Okay.
yes.
And you interviewed Mr. Kozak back on October 27th, is that right?
Yes.
And you had, I think, a 3-hour interview with him, is that
Yes.
right?
That's right.
Obtained that information, you reviewed the reports, is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked to do this by Mr. Parrish, is that right?
Yes.
And what type of evaluation did he actually ask you to perform?
He was pretty non-specific at that point.
Did it have to do, or did you know he was looking at criminal responsibility or diminished capacity evaluation?
I don't know if he spelled that out, but, you know, I've been doing this for 30 years. It wasn't hard to determine that that was what he was interested in. He was a criminal defense lawyer.
Okay. Did you put that in your report anywhere? For?
I think I did mention it at one point.
Do you have your report with you?
Yes, probably.
That's okay, we'll come back to it.
No, I can find it. I think I've located it already. I mean, if you want to
We'll go
come back.
back.
Okay.
Did you provide a forensic warning to the defendant when you interviewed him?
Yes, that his material could be used and come up in court, whatever he told me.
Okay. Did you put that in writing anywhere in that initial report?
No, I didn't. I don't commonly do that. Psychologists like to do that in some of their reports, but I don't think you normally find that in all forensic reports. I mean, it's obviously, you know, you're being asked by his defense attorney.
Does the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law recommend that you include that in your report and that you make sure that that is a tangible part of what you include when you are doing an evaluation, and you verify when you do your report that you've provided that information to the defendant?
That's part of the latter recommendation, but it's not usually used for preliminary reports.
Do you have with you a final report?
No, I never was asked to prepare one.
So all we have is the preliminary report, is that right?
Right. I mean, basically, I got a bunch more material within the last few weeks to review and was not asked to prepare a final report.
So Mr. Parrish never asked you to prepare a final report for this case?
That's correct, ma'am.
So all we have is your preliminary report?
Ask and answer 4 times.
Sustained.
In your clinical interview with Mr. Kozak, did you ask him about his psychiatric history?
Yes, I did, of course.
And he indicated he had no psychiatric history, isn't that right?
It is.
And I'm assuming you would have checked with his family about that too, is that correct?
I did check with them.
And they reported he had had no psychiatric history before, is that correct?
Right, and that's what that report reflects as well.
And he never reported any kind of even outpatient or inpatient psychiatric treatment of any kind, is that right?
Absolutely zero, not even a anti-anxiety agent from his general physician, which he also didn't have.
And he also didn't report that he had any substance abuse problems, is that right?
That's correct.
And you confirmed that with the family too?
That's correct as well.
No concerns of alcohol?
And he also confirmed that in his interrogation by the police after his arrest.
Okay. So substance abuses are not a problem?
I don't believe the law enforcement officers ever did a urinalysis for substance abuse with him, so that would have been, I guess, even more definitive. But in terms of history that was taken, he never reported having a substance abuse problem.
Okay. And there was no indication from anybody or anything you saw in the reports to indicate there was any substance use, is that right?
It was all consistent.
And
Oh, I said it was all consistent. Sorry.
did you administer any standardized measure to assess for psychopathology or malingering?
No.
And can you explain for the jury what malingering means?
Malingering would be when somebody tries to falsely present symptoms that would indicate that you have a mental illness, perhaps when you do not. There is, in this particular case, Mr. Kozak had made a full confession to the police and talked very candidly with me. He did not present mental illness himself as being part of the picture. From his presentation, there would have been no reason to suspect malingering when he's not presenting any evidence of a mental illness.
And he told you when you met with him that he shot Andrea Farrington. Is that
Certainly
right?
did.
Now, the psychological tests that are commonly or often employed in doing forensic exams by psychologists might include the SIMS, looking for malingering, the MFAS, I can't remember what that stands for, the MMPI-2, MMPI-3, those kinds of things, is that right?
Those aren't necessarily standard tests. Every psychologist employs something different. There is no standardization about what's employed. That's one of the difficulties. And some of the tests have problems. I'm really familiar with Richard Rogers, the guy who developed the structured interview of malingered symptoms.
Okay, well let me go on here, please.
Okay.
Was there a reason you didn't do any psychological testing when you met with Mr. Kozak?
Yeah, I didn't see that there would be any relevant information that would come from it.
And are you aware of the research that cites that anywhere from 17 to 15% of malingering occurs in forensic populations?
Yes, but if somebody's not presenting you any mental illness symptoms, there's no reason for you to suspect malingering.
Okay.
I mean, if the guy tells you he's not mentally ill, that he's never had any mental health treatment, that he doesn't report any particular mental health symptoms, why should you think he's malingering? You might think he's falsely trying to deny problems, but not embellishing them to get out of a criminal prosecution.
I want to talk about the mental status examination of your report, and I think you indicated that when you met with him, he was, I'm trying to find your exact words here. That he was articulate, His speech was logical and coherent?
Right, he wasn't rambling in his speech. He answered the questions pretty directly that I put to him. That also was true with the interrogation the police did.
Okay. He was able, in talking to the police as well, to be logical, coherent, and things such as that?
Yes.
And cognitively, he was also intact, I think is the term you used, is that right?
Right, I mean, basically, there was nothing wrong with his ability to understand, to calculate. His orientation was fine. I mean, he knew where he was, what the purpose of the interview was, etc.
He attended well to the questions, is that right?
Yes, he paid attention.
Okay. His memory for recent and remote events is within the normal range.
Right, he had excellent recall of everything I asked him about.
His intelligence appeared to be normal.
Right.
And he was cooperative in providing the information and responding to questions with you.
Right, he didn't appear defensive.
You didn't do any other formal testing, though, to assess his cognitive abilities, is that right?
If I might have, if I had seen that there was a problem there, but I
you
didn't.
didn't see anything?
I didn't see a problem there and didn't diagnose a problem there. I mean, there's no need for me to do tests to confirm the absence of something for which there's no signs or symptoms.
And in the conclusion of your report, you determined that he had the ability to plan, is that right?
Yes.
And that would
Well, that's obvious from his behavior too.
Okay. And that includes on June 12th, is that right?
Absolutely.
He was able to plan and carry out his actions that he wanted to?
Yes, absolutely.
He was able to follow, if he decided he had a mission, he could carry that out?
I won't comment about the logic of it or his recognition of the emotional part of it, but in terms of how to get from point A to point B, he knew how to do that.
And he was capable of doing that on June 12th of 2015, is that right?
Apparently, yes.
And you even included, I believe, on page 12 of your report, excuse me, page 13, he denied any substance abuse or psychotropic medication, as well as prior mental health treatment. You included that in there?
Yeah, right. We actually covered this a minute ago, but yes, absolutely.
He said usually when he thought about doing anything criminal, instead of acting it out, he wrote about it. Is that right?
Right. He engaged in quite a bit of fantasy, and at one point he had written, I guess, a novel about being an anti-hero. He stayed in the fantasy world quite a bit.
And you determined that his actions, or your perception of his actions on June 12th of 2015, that he was able to show planned and purposeful behavior with both before, during, and after the shooting. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you remember what led to that conclusion?
Yes, basically reading the investigative reports, the minutes of testimony, and later I read the entire Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation report, and it was fairly obvious that that he had set out on a course of action, ill-conceived, and there was certainly an overreaction to anything that precipitated it, but he certainly carried it through, and even more so since I think there was a Jessica German who had talked to in the interim and trying to dissuade him, and he still said basically, my mind is, can't concentrate on anything like calming down right now.
So he didn't follow her advice to calm down?
The conversation was bizarre. I think at the end of it he asked her if she'd run away with him.
What types of questions did you ask Mr. Kozak?
Well, all kinds of questions. You know, basically, I try and keep it open-ended. I ask him to tell me what happened. You know, I ask him about, if we want to go through the interview, basically ask him where he was born, who his parents were, what his situation was growing up, how he did in school, whether he had any major mental illnesses, you know, how he reacted with his peers, what he liked to do for hobbies, you know, who he interacted with in high school, what kind of activities he was involved with, you know, how he, what his dating experiences had been, how he met his wife, what the course of their relationship had been, how he met Andrea, how that relationship had progressed. So, you know, normal questions.
Okay. And when you concluded your preliminary diagnosis was intermittent explosive disorder versus disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and it
Right.
sounds like today you've changed that some.
No, I was always, I said it didn't fit really cleanly into either category, but as I got more history, it seemed like he fit more cleanly into the intermittent explosive disorder category.
And when did you decide and determine that he was borderline personality disorder as well?
Basically, after talking to his family and conducting a telephone interview with him and finding out about some of his emotional reactions back earlier coming up through his adolescence.
So you've conducted more interviews with Mr. Kozak since October 27th?
No, with his family by phone. Basically, he was not a very revealing historian. He doesn't give you, I mean, he answers your questions, but he doesn't embellish on it much. He doesn't give you very much background. And I was interested in what other people's observations of him were, what his mother has experienced, what his sister's experience was, and particularly what his wife's experience with him had been.
And you've told us today kind of the high points of what they told you about his behavior and observations of him, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you've shared those already in here?
Yes, we've been over that, sure.
So we don't need to go over those again?
I agree. Thank
Okay.
you.
Are you familiar with the DSM-5?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell me what the DSM-5 is?
Okay, every few years, the field of psychiatry, and I don't believe psychologists are included, but the field of psychiatry gets together and they basically try to settle on the categories of various mental illnesses. They may move things around, decide they want to put one particular disorder in a different chapter versus another. And the 5 stands for, this is the 5th edition, but there have been intermediates in between. I think there was a DSM-4, a DSM-4R, a DSM-4 text revision revised. So there were 3 editions of the DSM-4 before you got to the DSM-5. And basically they reorganized some things in the DSM-5, put some things in different names and in different chapters.
And the DSM-5 under the intermittent explosive disorder, like it does under all the other diagnostic categories, sets out what the criteria are for you to diagnose that particular disorder. Is that right?
Right, they give some guidelines.
Okay. And they define kind of what you should be looking for as a psychiatrist or psychologist in trying to diagnose somebody with this particular diagnosis?
Right, they give a general idea.
Okay. And so under intermittent explosive disorder, don't they set out the criteria as recurrent behavioral outbursts representing a failure to control aggressive impulses as manifested by either of the following? 1, verbal aggression, temper tantrums, tirades, verbal arguments or fights, or physical aggression toward property, animals, or other individuals occurring twice weekly on average for a period of 3 months. The physical aggression does not result in damage or destruction of property and does not result in physical injury to animals or individuals. Or 3 behavioral outbursts involving damage or destruction of property and or physical assault involving physical injury against animals or other individuals occurring within a 12-month period. Does that sound like the correct diagnosis?
I think you're right, correct.
Criteria?
Yes.
Okay. And it also says that the magnitude of aggressiveness expressed during the recurrent outbursts is grossly out of proportion to the provocation or to any precipitating or psychosocial stressors. Is that right?
Per my memory, yes, I think you're reading it well.
Okay. And the recurrent aggressive outbursts are not premeditated, i.e. they are impulsive and or anger-based and are not committed to achieve some tangible objective, for example, money, power, intimidation. Is that right?
Right, they're not like an aggression that would be, say, in the course of trying to be an enforcer to collect a debt, for example, where you're being purposely aggressive in order to achieve some particular concrete end that's a benefit to you.
And in your interviews with his family, with him, you never heard about 3 behavioral outbursts involving damage or destruction of property within the prior 12 months. Is that right?
Not specifically 12 months, but his wife Kelly also said that he would have temper outbursts as often as 5 times a day. So, and that was within the prior 12 months. He had talked about her, one of the categories you mentioned in there, in fact, the first one was verbal aggression, and there were quite a few instances of verbal aggression, particularly his wife Kelly said they would argue every day. He was very paranoid.
And did she tell you what period of time that was over?
Well, they've only been together a short period of time.
So are you saying that that was happening for a long period of time? Or
All since they got married, and since he came up to Iowa, which would have been around 3 months.
Was any of that included in Mr. Kozak, or you ever asked Mr. Kozak about any of that?
I did ask him if he got along with Kelly. He tended to tell me that he tended to be more disinterested. He focused more on the fact that he was very attracted to Andrea Farrington. He didn't specifically mention the difficulties with Kelly. I had to get that information from her.
But you were willing to give him that diagnosis back in, well, I think you completed the report at the end of January, and that was prior to you talking to Kelly Kozak, is that right?
Well, no, actually there had been some information. As you remember, as you went through the list of the things that I reviewed, some information from his mother, and there's some information from Kelly. But you got to remember that top line of that report is preliminary, and I was waiting on more information. And I narrowed it down to a couple of different diagnoses. So I wasn't writing a definitive, conclusive report for the court back in January. I was giving a report to Mr. Parrish to say what information I had, what preliminary conclusions I had drawn, and where I thought he ought to go from there.
But you didn't have from his mother that he had 3 angry episodes or 5 angry episodes every day?
No, I wasn't confirming the diagnosis at that point either. I was saying that from what I was picking up, it looked like it probably would fall in that category.
Although at that time, all you had was the reports that you've already told us today, where it was when he was in 9th or 10th grade, when he was sometime in 2014, another time I think in 2011. Those episodes, those don't fit anywhere in this criteria though, do they? And yet you were willing to put that down as a possible diagnosis back in January of this
It's
year?
a diagnostic hypothesis, of course. That's
It
the
was
way
a
medicine.
hypothesis?
Yeah, that's all I'm saying that was a diagnostic hypothesis at that time.
And now you're basing this pretty much on what Kelly Kozak has now told you?
No, I've got more information from his mother, his sister.
What other information do you have from his mother or sister to talk about the verbal aggressions that were occurring twice weekly for a period of 3 months?
No, that has to come from his wife. I mean, his mother wasn't present with him during those period of times. They only saw him intermittently.
Okay, and the 3 behavioral outbursts resulting in damage or destruction of property or physical assaults involving physical injury against animals or other individuals occurring within the 12-month period. You didn't get anything more from his mother or sister about that, did you?
No, and that isn't required. If you go back and read the thing as you did before, the operative word was or. It doesn't have to be that.
Verbal aggression or behavioral things. Okay.
Or.
And the mother and sister didn't have anything about the first one, so it's all based on Kelly Kozak?
In terms of the frequency,
Because his mother and sister only talked about 3 to 4 occasions that they could recall,
their contact with him was intermittent.
okay, up until 2014, isn't that right?
Their contact with him was still intermittent up to that point. He spent most of his time around other people or away or at work. And his mother, as you recall, returned to Texas and got married and left him up here for much of that period of time.
Wasn't he living with them most of the time?
Not after he graduated from high school, not after his mother went back to start a relationship with his stepfather back in Texas.
Let me ask you, did he ever report any kind of a juvenile criminal history
No.
or an adult criminal history?
Speeding ticket.
Assault, no history of assaultive behavior as a child, teen, or an adult?
No.
As a matter of fact, the only violent episode that you've heard from his wife, from his mother, from his sister, from him, was when he shot Andrea Farrington?
Well, they didn't talk about that, they weren't there.
Okay, but that's the only incident you heard from anyone that you evaluated, and anything you looked at that talked about any violent behavior of him was that one incident when he shot Andrea Farrington on June 12th.
In terms of physical aggression, that's correct.
Let's talk about the borderline personality disorder. That was not one of...
Counsel, is this a good breaking point?
Yes, this was fine.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will take our noon recess at this time. Please remember your admonition during the recess. We will reconvene at 1:30.
Sorry, Mr. Gordon, recess.
Please be seated. Counsel, is there anything we need to take up on the record before we recess?
No, Your Honor.
I don't think so, Your Honor.
All right, I'll see you back at 1:30 then.
Your Honor, I think we're still on schedule for an early.
Okay.
I just have one more witness. I just want to give the court that notice.
Well, as you know, I have somewhere to be later, so I won't be upset if it works out that way. So.
Thanks. No, you can't make it. I'm sure we see it. Or,
I don't know, they have somewhere around.
oh, yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah, sure. So you guys know him, because you guys smile every day, right?
Got a lot of connections.
So you're gonna be doing this for us tomorrow? Okay, because I'm like, sorry, I'll go pick up some for you. Only for you, no rush.
Okay. Very good.